The Senate chamber was supposed to be a place of order, of decorum, of measured words. But in that moment, the air cracked with something far more primal. Rand Paul leaned forward, his voice a rising roar, his finger slicing through the silence. Like a blade. You don't belong here. The words hit like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Staffers froze mid-note. And the press gallery leaned in, as though the ground itself had shifted. This wasn't just another partisan jab. This was exile, wrapped in arrogance, hurled with the full weight of entitlement and yetet. The very center of that storm sat JasmineCrockett.com. Steady, eyes unblinking, posture unbroken. Where others might have flinched, she did not move. Her stillness became its own kind of defiance. Quiet counterpunch louder than any shout. The room felt suspended, caught between outrage and anticipation. For a heartbeat, the chamber belonged to Rand Paul's fury. But then, the cameras, I caught Crockett's expression. Not shaken, not silenced. There was a composure there like steel forged in fire. It's like someone who had weathered storms far fiercer than a senator's tantrum. And, in that silence, a question began to hum. What would she say? The narrator's voice cut through the tension. When arrogance tried to exile truth.
Oh.
One response flipped the room in an instant. Every senator, every aide, every journalist in that chamber knew they were seconds away from something unforgettable. Rand Paul thought his shout would dominate the moment.
Ow.
Instead, it created a stage. A stage he did not control, because Crockett's reply was not going to be a rebuttal. It was going to be a reckoning. You could feel it in the way the chamber leaned forward, in the nervous shifting of seats, in the way Paul himself seemed almost too eager, mistaking his noise for victory. But the truth was about to arrive not in fury, but in clarity. Not in rage, but in resilience. And no one in that chamber could predict how Crockett's reply would echo far beyond those walls. Rand Paul's outburst was not a slip of the tongue. It was his trademark. For years, he had carved out a reputation as one of the Senate's loudest and most domineering voices, relishing in interruptions, drowning out opponents, and turning hearings into spectacles of ego. To his base, it was performance theater, proof of strength. To his critics, it was bluster, arrogance dressed as conviction. He had learned that if you shouted long enough, people stopped questioning whether you were right. They just remembered the volume, and now his volume had been aimed directly at Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't supposed to rattle the chamber. Too many in Washington, she was still the outsider, a young black congresswoman from Texas, underestimated by the same establishment that Paul embodied. They dismissed her sharpness as attitude, her resolve as inexperience, her truth as noise. To them, Crockett was temporary, a spark that would fizzle out. But that dismissal was precisely what made this moment so dangerous for Paul. Because when you underestimate someone who has fought for every inch of ground they stand on, you invite a response stronger than you can imagine. This wasn't just another clash of personalities. This was about legitimacy, about who gets to define what belonging in America looks like. Paul's words, "You don't belong here," were more than an insult to Crockett. They echoed every gate slammed on those told they weren't enough. Of something not white enough, not wealthy enough, not quiet enough. It was the oldest weapon of power exclusion, wielded in full view of the nation, and that made Crockett's silence, her steady gaze, all the more electrifying. Because what loomed wasn't merely a rebuttal, it was a stand. A stand not just for herself, but for millions watching who had heard those same words in their own lives. The stakes rose with every second of silence. This was no longer a policy fight over committee reports or legislative language. This was the Senate floor transformed into a stage where America's deeper struggle played out. Who gets to speak? Who gets to stay? Who gets to claim identity? As fully American, in Paul's mind, his outburst was a show of dominance. But in truth, it was a challenge thrown down in the middle of a battlefield much larger than himself. The press gallery sensed it, scribbling faster. The audience beyond, the chamber, watching on screens across the country, could feel it. Something bigger was taking shape. This was not going to be remembered as a senator's insult. It was going to be remembered as a clash over the soul of representation itself. And in that instant, Crockett's role shifted. She was no longer just responding to Rand Paul. She was embodying something far greater: the demand for belonging, for truth, for dignity in a space that had too often denied it. The chamber leaned into the silence, the air thick with the expectation of history in the making. Paul believed he had landed the blow that would end the exchange before it began. But he hadn't lit a flame he could control, because with the chamber on edge, the spark was lit one that Paul never saw spreading. Rand Paul had built his brand. In the Senate, the way some men build fortresses brick by brick, each one louder than the last. From the moment he stepped into Washington, he staked his claim, not by offering new ideas, but by amplifying his contrarian streak into a weapon. He was the senator who thrived on pushing against consensus, the man who relished standing alone. If it meant cameras turned his way. His ideology was libertarian on paper, but in practice, it was performance politics at full volume, brash, defiant, always ready to interrupt. That was Rand Paul's persona, and he wore it like armor. To his supporters, this was refreshing. They saw a politician unafraid to sneer at sacred cows, to dismiss experts, to thumb his nose at tradition. To his critics, however, it was something else entirely: volume over substance, swagger instead of depth. Paul knew that in a chamber of rules, rituals, and hierarchy, he could seize attention not by finesse, but by force. And more often than not, it worked. He wasn't the first senator to wield arrogance as a tool. History is lined with men who filled the chamber with the sound of their own voices, believing the louder they thundered, the more truth they owned. From Joseph McCarthy's witch hunt tirades to Jesse Helms's sneering dismissals, the Senate has always had its bullies, men who confused intimidation with leadership. Paul was their modern echo, using sarcasm as a blade, condescension as a shield, and volume as his crown. He thrived on that formula. He'd seen opponents stumble before, tripping over their own words when his voice rose, their focus shattered by his mocking tone. A smirk here, a raised eyebrow there, the smallest gestures weaponized into psychological warfare, a bait. He carried himself less like a statesman and more like a heckler who'd taken the microphone hostage, and in Crockett. She was newer to the national stage, a freshman compared to his years of seniority. He thought she'd wilt under his dismissals, fold beneath the smug certainty of a man who had spent decades practicing the art of Senate theater. To Paul, this was muscle memory, another chance to remind the chamber who commanded the floor. His strategy was simple: drown out her legitimacy before she could even begin to speak. Label her an outsider, then punctuate it with a cutting blow. You don't belong here. It was vintage Rand Paul, a line meant to belittle, to sting, and most importantly, to frame the fight on his terms. But this time, something shifted. Because where others had once stumbled under his smugness, Crockett stood steady. Where others had bent beneath his interruptions, she simply stared back, unmoved. And that, though subtle, was the beginning of his unraveling. The power of arrogance is fragile. It depends on the other side flinching. When they don't, the arrogance begins to collapse under its own weight. The narrator's irony practically wrote itself. Rand Paul, the senator who had left so many rattled, was about to stage his own undoing. His reliance on volume had become habit, his swagger second nature. He mistook predictability for power, forgetting that every fortress, no matter how thick, has its cracks. Paul's arrogance blinded him. Didn't recognize that the climate around him had shifted, that America was no longer so easily impressed by a man shouting down a woman, especially one whose story resonated with millions, who knew what it felt like to be told they didn't belong. He believed he was replaying an old script, one where his voice filled the chamber and his opponent shrank. But arrogance is a dangerous mirror. It reflects only what the wielder wants to see. Paul never noticed the smirks turning against him, the whispers in the gallery, the tightening jaws of colleagues who knew the optics he was creating. He thought he was commanding the room. In truth, he was writing himself into the role of villain more clearly than any narrator ever could. And villains, no matter how loud, always meet their reckoning. The moment Rand Paul jabbed his finger and shouted, "You don't belong here," he believed he had sealed the exchange, that his words would echo with authority. Instead, they rang with something else: desperation, insecurity. The hollow sound of a man too used to hearing only his own echo. The Senate chamber had seen its share of bullies. But bullies share the same fatal flaw. They mistake silence for surrender. Crockett's silence wasn't retreat. It was calm before the storm, because arrogance blinds, and Paul never saw the storm coming. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in marble halls or polished chambers. It began in the rough edges of working-class Texas, where opportunity was never handed out, and survival meant learning to fight for every inch of ground. She was born into a world that did not expect her to rise, a world that underestimated the weight of her grit. While others measured their childhood by what they were given, Crockett's childhood was measured by what she and her family went without, how they endured anyway. In neighborhoods where the spotlight of power rarely shone, she absorbed lessons far more lasting than anything taught in a classroom. She learned that dignity matters most when the world tries to strip it away. She learned that silence in the face of injustice is a form of surrender. And she learned, above all, that survival itself could be an education, shaping her not only into a student of books, but a student of struggle. When she pursued her education, it wasn't a luxury or a family tradition. It was as an act of rebellion, a declaration that her future would not be dictated by circumstance. Nights of study were lit not by entitlement but by determination. Each textbook a weapon against the quiet prejudice that told her people they were meant to stay in the margins. For Jasmine, graduating wasn't just a personal triumph. It was proof. Proof that the doors closed on her community could, in fact, be forced open. Her path to law was forged in fire. She chose that profession not because it promised prestige, but because she had seen firsthand what injustice looked like. She had seen how the law could be used to oppress, to disenfranchise, to erase, and she decided she would wield it differently. Not as a tool of gatekeeping, but as a shield for those who were never meant to be protected. In courtrooms, she carried not only her own voice, but the voices of those who had been silenced. Every case became more than paperwork. It was another chance to tilt the balance, even slightly, toward fairness. This is where the contrast with Rand Paul becomes undeniable. He was born into privilege, son of a political dynasty. Raised in a household where politics was dinner table conversation and opportunity was assumed, Paul's stage was lit before he ever set foot on it.
Crockett,
By comparison, had to be built from scratch, plank by plank, with her own hands. His authority came through inheritance, hers through resilience. His confidence was rooted in expectation. Hers was forged from proving herself again and again to a world that doubted her. That difference mattered, because when Crockett walked into the Senate chamber, she did not carry the fragility of someone who feared being seen as an outsider. She carried the lived knowledge that she was an outsider, and that this was her strength, not her weakness. Where Paul's arrogance was a mask for insecurity, Crockett's calm was born of survival. She had already faced battles that would have broken others. A raised voice, a pointed finger, even the shout of "You don't belong here, none." Of it carried more weight than the barriers she had already overcome. Her education had always been more than degrees on paper. It was rooted in sacrifice, in the family members who worked long hours so she could study, in the mentors who urged her to keep going when doors slammed, in the communities who saw in her a hope they themselves were denied. Every courtroom victory, every legislative stand, was not just her story, it was theirs too. And that is what made her dangerous to men like Rand Paul. Because Crockett didn't need to posture. She didn't need volume to claim authority. Authority was written. In the quiet battles already won, in the survival already proven. When she spoke, it wasn't a performance. It was truth distilled through struggle, sharpened by sacrifice, and delivered with the certainty of someone who had already stared down the impossible. It was this resilience, born of grit, of hardship, of an unshakable belief in belonging, that shaped her reply before she ever opened her mouth. A reply not rehearsed, not memorized, but lived. The Senate chamber that night did not simply witness a debate. They witnessed the collision of two Americas, one raised on entitlement, the other risen through perseverance. And as Paul leaned into his arrogance, mistaking volume for victory, Crockett remained steady, calm, quiet. Her composure wasn't passive, it was power restrained. A storm waiting for the precise moment to break. That resilience built her truth. That truth was about to silence the Senate floor, because when Crockett finally rose to speak, the room would never forget it. The chamber had barely settled. From the first shock, when Rand Paul pressed forward, determined to make his dominance absolute, he leaned across his desk, papers in hand, shuffling them with theatrical noise, the rustle meant to mimic evidence. His voice rose again, the cadence sharp, dripping with contempt. "Let's not pretend," he sneered, holding the papers aloft. "These so-called credentials, these inflated claims, they don't make you credible. They don't make you one of us." He slapped the stack down with a thud, the sound echoing like a gavel. "What America needs is honesty. Not a lecture from someone who has no place lecturing." Gasps rippled through the chamber. A few senators shifted in their chairs, eyes darting to one another. The cameras caught the uneasy glances, the subtle shaking of heads. It was the kind of moment that felt unstable, as though the balance of decorum itself was on trial. Yet in the eye of that storm sat Jasmine Crockett. Her gaze steady, her voice untouched by the tremor Paul tried to force upon. The room, she did not flinch, did not meet his frenzy with frenzy. Instead, she remained anchored, eyes fixed forward. Hands folded as though she were waiting for something inevitable. Paul mistook that stillness for weakness. He saw the composure not as preparation, but as hesitation. So he pushed harder, mocking, interrupting, cutting her off before she could answer even the simplest question. His words tumbled over each other, not crafted arguments, but a barrage of sound meant to bury her beneath their weight. "She doesn't answer the question because she can't." Paul barked, his fingers stabbing the air, his laugh short and derisive. "She hides behind big words, hides behind her story. But facts don't lie, and facts say she doesn't belong here." The murmurs grew louder. Even those who supported him looked uneasy, as if sensing the line he was crossing. Senators leaned in, some whispering to aides, others exchanging tense glances. It was no longer merely a debate, it was the spectacle of arrogance running unchecked, and still Crockett did not break. She waited. Each interruption, each sneer, each wave of paper only made her silence more deliberate. She was not engaging in Paul's theater because she understood something he did not. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes power waits. Finally, when the noise reached its peak, she drew in a slow breath and lifted her chin. The room noticed. A shift passed through the chamber, so subtle at first, but undeniable. The interruptions began to falter, Paul's words suddenly seeming frantic, overcompensating, the laughter thinner than before. Crockett's calm had become the contrast, and it cast his arrogance in harsher light with every passing second. She let the silence hang. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of calculation. It stretched long enough to make even Paul pause, the echo of his last insult still hanging above the chamber. Eyes turned. The cameras zoomed. Viewers at home leaned forward, and then Crockett spoke, not loudly, not with theatrics, but with precision, her voice steady and clear, a scalpel cutting through the noise. Her line was sharp, simple, and unflinching. It did not just respond to Paul's attack, it ended it. The chamber froze. Paul's gesture, mid-air, faltered. His mouth hung open as though ready to fire back, but no words came. The noise, the mockery, the paper waving, the barrage of arrogance, all of it collapsed in an instant beneath the weight of her reply. And with one sharp line, Crockett stopped Paul cold. The hush in the chamber was thick enough to feel, the kind of silence that prickled against the skin. Rand. Paul's last words still echoed faintly, but their bite had dulled. Every eye turned toward Jasmine Crockett, waiting. She had been still through the storm, unshaken, deliberate, and now she finally rose, her presence commanding without effort. Her voice was not a shout. It was steadier than the wood beneath her hands, deliberate in its rhythm, measured in its tone. Belonging, she said. The single word hanging in the air like a bell toll isn't granted by volume. The pause was surgical. Every senator, every aide, every unseen viewer felt it cut through the noise. Paul's smirk wavered. The confidence of a man who had long relied on bluster suddenly slipping. Crockett's gaze moved deliberately across the chamber before settling back on him. It's earned by truth, and the truth is why I'm here. The room leaned forward as though pulled by a string. For the first time, it was not Paul setting the rhythm, it was Crockett, the authority. In her words was undeniable, and the air itself seemed to bend toward her. Paul's mouth twitched, ready to retort. He fumbled with the papers he had waved so triumphantly only moments before, as though they might still shield him, as he began, but his voice cracked against the force of her calm. Crockett did not raise her tone. Didn't need to. You speak of belonging, she continued, as though it is your gift to grant, your privilege to bestow. But America does not belong to arrogance, Senator. It belongs to the people who carry its promise, even when others try to shut them out. Her words landed with the weight of history, the kind that resonated deeper than policy or party. Paul shifted in his seat, his rhythm shattered, his confidence rattled. He tried again, a weak chuckle tumbling out as he leaned forward. That's just rhetoric, he insisted, but his voice betrayed him, brittle and unsteady. Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed locked, her poise unwavering. Rhetoric is empty when it hides from truth. But truth, she gestured around the chamber, to the people watching. To the ideals enshrined in the very walls, truth has roots. My roots are in the communities that built this country, brick by brick, vote by vote, sacrifice by sacrifice. That is why I stand here, not because you allow it, but because America requires it. A murmur rose, not the restless kind that had followed Paul's tirade, but a deeper, resonant sound of recognition. Some senators nodded subtly. A few staffers, trying to keep composure, let the faintest smiles slip. The cameras caught it all. The shift, the weight tipping. Paul's face flushed. He slammed a hand down on his desk, leaning forward. You're twisting, but Crockett's interruption was not loud. It was precise. I'm correcting. Yet the single word hit harder than his shouting ever had. The chamber reacted audibly. This time, not applause yet, but something close. Gasps. The sound of people leaning back. The quiet acknowledgement of dominance shifting hands. Paul opened his mouth again, but the rhythm was gone. He stammered, glanced down at his papers, and found no refuge. The noise that had once been his weapon now betrayed him, exposing the emptiness beneath the performance. Crockett pressed forward, each line sharper than the last. You want to measure my belonging by your standards of privilege? Let's talk about belonging, Senator. Belonging is the mother who works 2 jobs and still finds time to vote. Belonging is the student drowning in debt who still believes this country can deliver opportunity. Belonging is every American who refuses to be told they are less than, worthy by someone shouting from a pedestal. The chamber was alive now, the air electric. Crockett was no longer responding to Paul. She was addressing America itself. The cameras panned to senators shifting uncomfortably, to aides scribbling furiously. To the spectators whose eyes widened at every word, Paul tried one last time, his voice rising desperately. This is not about, but Crockett cut cleanly. Not with volume, but with conviction. No, Senator. This is exactly about who decides, about who gets to claim this country as theirs. And let me tell you, it will not be decided by who shouts the loudest. It will be decided by who stands on truth. For the first time all night, applause fluttered in the chamber, subtle, restrained, but undeniable. A few claps quickly hushed, yet unmistakable. The sound echoed louder than Paul's shouting ever had, because it broke the unspoken rules of the Senate. People don't clap in the middle of debate, but they did. For her, Paul froze. His eyes darted, searching for an ally, a sign that he still commanded the room. But all he found were downcast gazes, tightened lips. the quiet betrayal of a chamber no longer with him. Crockett stood taller, not with arrogance but with gravity. You said I don't belong here. But I do. Because belonging isn't a gift you hand down, Senator. It's a truth you can't deny. And then she stopped. The silence that followed was not the fragile silence of tension. It was the heavy silence of finality. A silence that settled like a verdict. Paul's lips parted, ready to fire back, but no words came. The rhythm that had carried him through countless debates, countless spectacles, had abandoned him. The chamber waited. Paul faltered. And for the first time, his silence said more than his shouting ever could. And then silence. Paul had no comeback. The silence in the chamber didn't stay contained within those walls. Within minutes, the ripple escaped. First as whispers among staffers, then as hurried texts to reporters, and then, like a flood, it reached the outside world. By the time Crockett returned to her seat, the nation was already buzzing. On Twitter, the first hashtag appeared almost instantly. #Paul shut down. The phrase caught fire, repeating thousands of times in a matter of minutes. Clips of Rand Paul's red face, frozen mid-shout, side by side with Jasmine Crockett's poised expression, spread like digital wildfire. By the hour's end, another tag had risen alongside it. #Crockett belongs. The two trended together, a digital yin and yang, arrogance crumbling, dignity rising. Users piled on with captions, "Volume doesn't equal victory." This is what grace under fire looks like. Crockett flipped the Senate with one line. Memes flooded timelines. One image stitched Paul's finger-pointing fury next to Crockett's steady gaze. The caption reading, "The sound of arrogance versus the power of truth." TikTok edits set Crockett's line, "Belonging isn't granted by volume. It's earned by truth." Against swelling music, the kind used for movie trailers, teenagers who had never watched a Senate hearing suddenly lip-synced her words. Into their phones, the moment transformed into anthem. Cable news couldn't resist. Commentators who had grown used to dismissing Senate debates as dull and procedural now labeled it the Senate clapback of the year. Headlines ran wild. Crockett turns Paul's shout into silence. Belonging reframed in one viral moment, Senate drama captivates America. But beyond the noise of trending topics and media spin, something deeper was happening. For activists, Crockett's reply was more than a mic drop. It was recognition. For years, voices from marginalized communities had fought to be heard in rooms dominated by privilege and condescension. Watching her not only withstand the attack, but turn it inside out, that was fuel. Social media wasn't just laughing at Paul. It was cheering for itself. Facebook timelines filled with personal reflections. A Latina mother posting, "My daughter asked me tonight why that man said she doesn't belong. I showed her Jasmine Crockett's answer. She smiled and said then, 'I belong too,'" a young immigrant tweeted. "I didn't know politics could sound like me until today." Pundits weighed in. Progressive commentators praised her poise, her refusal to be baited. Even some conservatives, weary of Paul's antics, admitted grudging respect. "I don't agree with her politics," one columnist wrote, "but the composure she showed was statesmanlike in a way the Senate hasn't seen in years." The energy spilled offline, too. At rallies that weekend, signs popped up with Crockett's words, "Truth is why I'm here." No. Student groups at universities hosted impromptu Crockett watch parties, dissecting every line of her reply. For a generation raised on viral culture, this was more than politics. It was performance fused with principle. Drama turned into dignity. Rand Paul, meanwhile, faced a different wave. Clips of him stammering, his attempted interruptions swallowed. By Crockett's.com/circulated with mocking captions, "When your debate notes are just volume control." His defenders scrambled, framing it as passion or misunderstood context. But the damage was done. The moment was seared into the collective imagination. Paul shouting, Crockett dismantling. That silence sealing the verdict, and yet it wasn't just entertainment. What made it powerful was its symbolism. It wasn't just one senator silencing another. It was the idea that identity and belonging in America could no longer be dictated by gatekeepers of privilege. Crockett hadn't only defended herself, She had redefined the battlefield. Commentators began to say as much. On MSNBC, one host declared, this was more than a takedown. It was a rewriting of who gets to own the word American. In progressive circles, the clip wasn't just replayed. It was studied, analyzed, framed as a masterclass in reclaiming dignity without losing composure. Late-night comedians joined in, but their punchlines carried admiration. One joked. Rand Paul tried to yell at her out of the Senate, and Jasmine Crockett yelled at him out of relevance without raising her voice. The audience roared, laughter mixed with applause, signaling that the moment had seeped into culture itself. The impact didn't stop at politics. It bled into workplaces, classrooms, family dinners. People who had long felt the sting of being told they didn't belong found a new script to answer back. Crockett's line became a mantra, printed on shirts, shared in group chats, whispered, like armor before job interviews or protests, and through it all, the viral clip kept spreading. Every replay, every share, every caption turned Crockett's composure into a symbol. Paul's shouting had sought to exclude her, to define the boundaries of belonging. But her reply cracked those boundaries wide open, exposing their fragility. Senate floor had witnessed many clashes, but this one was different. It wasn't remembered as another partisan squabble. It was remembered as a cultural hinge. A moment where the underdog didn't just survive, she claimed. The center of the stage, and that was the shockwave no one could contain. But this viral moment wasn't just entertainment. It redefined how power is perceived in America. In the days after the clash, as clips continued to circulate and the hashtags refused to fade, Jasmine Crockett herself returned to the heart of the matter. Reporters asked about her poise, her composure, her sharpness in the face of Rand Paul's fury. But she didn't lean into the spectacle. She leaned into the lesson. Power isn't about shouting, she said, her tone steady, almost reflective. It's about the truth. It's about showing up day after day for people who've been told they don't belong. That's what gives you a voice, not volume, not privilege. Truth. That reframing transformed the viral moment into something larger than a debate. It became a mirror, reflecting back America's struggle over who belongs and who gets to decide. Crockett refused the premise that belonging was a gift handed down from gatekeepers like Paul. Instead, she said she revealed it as something deeper, something earned, lived, embodied by sacrifice and authenticity, and the resonance was undeniable. For every immigrant who had once been told to go back, for every student doubted in a classroom, for every worker dismissed in a boardroom, her words carried weight. She had turned one senator's insult into a universal declaration. Belonging isn't permissioned by the powerful. It's claimed by those who walk in truth. Her line became a mantra. Activists repeated it at marches. Teachers quoted it in classrooms. Parents whispered it to their children before sending them into a world that too often questioned their place. In Crockett's steady refusal to be shaken, Peep found both reflection and roadmap. Because authenticity, she reminded the country, is the deepest rebuttal to arrogance. Privilege can yell. Arrogance can wave papers, pound tables, fill the air with noise. But only truth can silence a room. The emotional crescendo swelled, not because she embarrassed Rand Paul, but because she reminded America of its own unfinished promise. Respect isn't won by intimidation, and it isn't inherited through family, names, or legacy seats. Respect is earned by standing in the storm and refusing to bow. Respect is earned by authenticity. The moment also carried a subtle but powerful inversion. Rand Paul had tried to exile her with his words, to brand her an outsider in a chamber steeped in tradition. But in doing so, he revealed the fragility of that tradition when it meets someone who doesn't flinch. Crockett didn't just belong. In that chamber, she belonged to the spirit of what democracy should be. Voices rising not by privilege, but by truth. And that was the universal takeaway. America isn't defined by who yells the loudest. It's defined by those who carry themselves with dignity even when shouted down. It's defined by those who claim their place, not because they were given permission, but because they know their voice matters. The crowd outside politics felt that in their bones. The viral moment wasn't remembered as a Crockett versus Paul showdown alone. It was remembered as a lesson etched in real time, proof that the truest strength isn't theatrical fury, but unshakable composure. That the loudest voice doesn't set the terms of belonging, the truest one does. And that's why, long after the hashtags fade and the memes drift down the timeline, the line endures. Because it wasn't just a clapback, it was a compass. Once again, history proved the loudest voice doesn't win, the truest one does. From the very first moment, when Rand Paul's voice cut through the chamber with that stinging insult, "You don't belong here," the scene seemed written for arrogance. He leaned on bluster, he leaned on noise, and for a moment it looked as though the old patterns of intimidation might hold. But then came JasmineCrockett.com, steady, refusing to yield. Her composure reshaped the air in that room. Every taunt he threw only set the stage for her reply. And when she finally delivered her words that belonging isn't granted by volume, but earned through truth, it wasn't just a counterpunch. It was a mic drop that reverberated far beyond the chamber walls. The story didn't end there. Social media exploded. Hashtags surged. Americans who had felt overlooked or silenced suddenly felt seen. What began as one senator's attempt to exile her turned into a national moment of validation. Crockett flipped the Senate stage, and in doing so, she reminded us that dignity has a way of triumphing over arrogance. Every single time, and that's why this moment matters. Because it's bigger than politics. It's about what kind of America we want to believe in, and who we choose to stand with when the shouting starts. So here's the call. If you believe that dignity speaks louder than arrogance, that truth resonates deeper than noise, share this story. Let others see it. Let others feel it. And subscribe to this channel, because together, we'll keep telling the stories that remind us who we are and what we can become. Because in the end, truth doesn't shout, it resonates.